we are seeing an increased use of what I like to call low-hanging fruit surveillance techniques by governments all around the world. And in the United States, for example, there is conflicting legal definitions of how this information or these strategies are used in order for law enforcement to be able to conduct what they deem necessary for their investigations. One example of this is the use of what are called geofence warrants, which is when a law enforcement agency requests a warrant for an entire location that blankets an area and a point in time and looks at every single user of a specific cell phone platform that is being geolocated to that location through use of the third-party data that companies like Google provide on their users. A court in the United States in 2024 declared that geofence warrants were categorically unconstitutional and likened them to mass surveillance, violating the Fourth Amendment search and seizure rights of U.S. citizens. However, later, another court determined that rights are not violated by use of geofence warrants because they are focused to a specific time and location. Now, my take on that is if the law of the country that I live in cannot agree on one specific thing, then I am going to need to focus on that or pay attention to that in order to take matters into my own hands to protect myself when it comes to that specific subject. And what this tells us is that the government surveillance and the law enforcement surveillance are increasingly turning to third-party data use and third-party access through the devices that we carry on us on a daily basis, mainly our cell phones. And if you carry a phone that is blasting out all of your information, whether it's your location or your health data or checking in on social media in specific locations, you are volunteering this information, and law enforcement is increasingly being allowed to use information that is being volunteered. So that removes your right to privacy in the case of volunteered information. So what does that tell us? That tells us that if you don't volunteer the information, then they have no right to use it. And that is what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the daily driver that I use as a mobile device, which is a Pixel that is flashed with the GrapheneOS operating system. Originally, when I started putting together the content for today's episode, I started creating a list of pros and cons of related to privacy and security for iPhone versus stock Android versus GrapheneOS. And then I quickly realized that I'm not here to try to convince anybody to move away from stock Android or move off of the iOS platform. iOS users are unlikely to change the convenience or all of their data in the environment. Is just too much for them to deal with. They just can't justify it, and that's okay. Everybody knows and understands the pros and cons at this point of the iOS platform. Apple products have very great security, and they have really great privacy from everybody except from Apple. And if you have deemed that an acceptable risk, then carry on smartly. Today's episode is going to be a case for GrapheneOS as a daily use operating system on your device. So, welcome back to the OPSEC Podcast. I am your host, Alan Pace, and I want to have a conversation about GrapheneOS as a daily operator for everyday use on a Pixel device, which is what I use. And the reason I came to this idea of a topic for today's episode is because I've recently read and heard multiple different arguments about why it's not practical or it's not recommended for average users or daily use. And I strongly disagree with that. Now, I consider myself more of an advanced user of these types of products, as well as a relatively tech-savvy person. So one of the primary excuses, I guess, would be that flashing GrapheneOS is too difficult for average users. And in the past, I would have agreed with that. However, the GrapheneOS development team has created a automatic flashing web-based application that is excellent and extremely easy, as well as an instruction manual on how to do it. It's very quick, it's very simple, and if you come to the table with a fully carrier-unlocked Pixel device, then it does not take very long to complete. So that is not an issue any longer. The second issue I hear is that the functionality is not 100%. And again, I would have agreed with that in the past. But for now, at this point in time, I believe that it's probably 90 to 95% functionality compared to a stock standard Pixel or Android device out of the box. With a few quirks and a few exceptions, these things are always going to have give and takes, but sacrifices that I think you have to make with GrapheneOS are minimal to nil at this point in time because of the excellent work the dev team has done. One of the examples of that is the Google Play services were previously not installed on these devices, and that limited lots of functionalities and also prevented certain apps from running. The GrapheneOS has now offered a sandboxed opportunity or option for the Google Play services to be installed on your device. And what that does is that separates them from the primary Android operating system and does not allow them to take it over like it does on stock Android devices. A quick explanation about Google Play services for those of you who are unaware is the Android operating system is an open source project. It is the operating system for your phone, just like iOS, just like Windows or Mac OS or Linux is for your computers. Android is that for your phone, and it is based on Linux kernel. Now, Google has created this subsystem software called Google Play Services, and it is, when it is installed on top of Android, it essentially acts as management software and takes over your operating system on your device. And they have also made the app development pipeline dependent in certain ways for developers to use the Google Play service function for the maximum benefit to their app development and the convenience of their app development. I won't go into a whole lot of details. I'm not an expert on the subject, but one of the easiest things that people understand as an example of this is push notifications, which almost everybody uses and relies on. That is a function that's provided not by your operating system of Android, but is provided by the Google Play services spyware that is required for certain applications to push notifications out and for you to receive them. So Google Play Services ends up taking over your device and having access to all of your data, all of your account information, all of the apps on your phone, and all of the functionality of how you operate your phone. On stock Android devices, you are not able to disable it or uninstall it. It also has management capabilities that prevent you from uninstalling certain apps as well, or disabling certain apps. I have seen stock Android devices where I have gone into the apps menu and tried to disable an app, and it's grayed out. And on my GrapheneOS device, I can easily go in there and just disable that app, exactly the same app. It depends on what we're talking about. There's too many examples to list, but Samsung devices are a good example of that, because not only do they have a full reliance on Google Play Services, but they also have their own spyware and their own bloatware built on top of Android and Google Play Services. And so they lock a lot of that stuff down as well. You are not capable of uninstalling a lot of Samsung applications or software on the back end as much as you are on other platforms. So what is GrapheneOS? That's a pretty well-known version of Android at this point in time that is focused on privacy and security features as a default rather than as an exception. As previously mentioned, an example of that is the Sandbox Google Play Services granular permissions for each app, like network access, sensor access, storage, contacts, all finally monitored manually by the user and not granted default permissions by Google Play Services or the app itself, which is an extreme privacy boost. Other features that I really appreciate are randomizing MAC addresses. And if you're not familiar with what that is, a MAC address is essentially a hardware address. It's a number that every piece of network hardware is issued. So your computer, your network card has a MAC address in it. Your phone has a MAC address. And GrapheneOS randomizes that number. It also has features that prevent metadata from being leaked through files such as pictures or screenshots. And it typically, on most applications, it disables sensor permissions and various other permissions by default, and it only allows the bare minimum network access when you install apps. GrapheneOS also comes with no bloatware. Unlike many stock Android builds, PixelOS has the Pixel Experience, I think, which has some apps that are considered bloatware. The Samsung devices are obviously littered with it. GrapheneOS does not have any. It is stripped all the way down to the bare minimum requirements for operating as a phone, and then you build on it from there. Now, the benefit from this is a lot of potential performance increases, such as your battery use goes down, your data use goes down, because you don't have all this extra garbage running in the background. Overall, at this stage in development, GrapheneOS offers, as I said previously, maybe 90 to 95% functionality compared to stock Android, which to me is a significant value to my security and privacy stance, to me, that's almost no sacrifice at all. So with all of these leaps forward that GrapheneOS has provided the user, I don't see any justification to not use it, especially if you're already an Android user. The average person gets a new phone every single year. And if you're coming up on a new phone, make your next phone a Pixel. Pixel 10 is about to come out, and that means that the price of Pixel 9s is going to go down, and the price of Pixel 8s is going to go down even further. You can pick up a Pixel 8 for $200 or $300 right now, and the Pixel 9s are still full price, but they should be going down around the holidays, if not before. So, having said all of that, let's explore some of the trade-offs that you may or may not want to deal with in your personal setup. But again, like I said, at this point, it's minuscule in my opinion, and the security and posture increase that you receive from GrapheneOS is undeniable. So I believe that the most difficult transition from a stock Android device to a GrapheneOS device is the learning curve and configuration work that it takes to get it set up. And it's not that much more than a regular device, but it does require some extra effort. So when you get a new phone, you turn it on and you go through the Android setup screen. Everybody's aware of this, and you set everything up, and then you start adding your apps through the Google Play Store, which requires a Google account. A GrapheneOS device, you go through the same process after you flash the device with GrapheneOS, and then you manually install a app called Aurora Store, which is a scrape of the Google Store that requires no credentials or no Gmail account. It provides anonymous login opportunity for the Google Play Store. From that point, you will go search for and install the required apps that you want on your device. Now, what I like about the Aurora Store is it has a function from a company called Exodus, which searches the code of all of the apps on the Google Play Store and provides you with a list of the amount of trackers that are embedded in that app. So it gives you a bit of awareness on where your data is going when you use that app, which is, to me, brilliant. And I really love that feature. As I previously mentioned, there is some app features or compatibility issues with GrapheneOS. Some of the phone apps don't like to ring as much. I know that MySudo is a app that I've talked about in previous episodes, and I rely on it heavily, and I do recall having issues with it previously for ringing in new calls or texts because of the push notifications service. However, I've been using it for quite some time with Google Play services installed in a sandboxed mode on GrapheneOS, and I've had no issues with it. Another complaint that people have is convenience, and we've covered this in previous episodes. Convenience is a trap, essentially. And what the companies that harvest your data are relying on is your laziness or your need or your justification for convenience to provide that data or to use this app that leaks data, and you just have to accept that or not. That's completely your decision. But I try to not accept any of those. If I see there's an app on the Aurora Store and has 16 trackers in, that's a hard no. I do not use it. I will limit the trackers to ones that are justified and necessary only, and I also usually go down a little bit of a rabbit hole to find out what those companies are doing with my data. But I am a crazy person, so most people won't be doing that. Another concern that some people will have is device support and limitations for customer service. When you flash a Pixel phone with an alternative operating system such as Graphene, you are voiding out your warranty if you have one. You're also pretty much removing the ability of your cell phone service to provide you any technical support, because they just can't guarantee that you didn't break it, and they're not even going to want to touch it in fear that you would possibly accuse them of damaging your device. But my response to that is the instructions that are provided from Graphene, the automatic flashing web app that they have provided, which is awesome and amazing compared to the old days when we would have to flash these devices using Odin, and I think is what it was called, and then it could potentially brick it. And I've bricked a few in my day when I first started flashing devices more than 10 years ago. None of those issues exist with Graphene, and it really makes it within reach of basic users to be able to accomplish what previously was very, very difficult and risky. So I don't think that that's much of an issue. The device support, I mean, to me, I don't know if anybody agrees with this, but I don't know the last time I've ever relied on a Verizon person to tell me how to operate or fix my phone, ever. Those guys are salespeople. They sell, accounts. That's it. So tech support is very rarely used in this. And even if you did need basic tech support for getting on the network, they can walk you through the network setup, and they don't need to worry about what operating system your phone uses. Next, I will point out a few advanced features that I really appreciate about GrapheneOS. One of those is two-factor screen lock. Now, the Graphene has provided a two-factor screen lock function that is biometric as well as a PIN code that you can choose to use if you want, or you can use the standard one-factor. I've employed the two-factor, and it's quite nice. It is also very annoying because it is inconvenient. And I have started to try to use those as regulation roadblocks for me doing dumb shit like checking my text messages while I drive, which I try to not do. But like everybody else, every once in a while, I'll think I need to look at my phone for something, and you know what? That's all it takes is one time, one bad decision. And I know most of us will see other people staring at their phone screens when they pass us, and you probably shout inside your own car by yourself at that person. And then 10 minutes later, I'll just do the same thing real quick without thinking about it. I try to avoid doing that, and I try to use these security features for reducing the convenience for access to my device when I'm doing things like driving. Now, sometimes that can create a problem, but if I really need to, I'll pull over and I'll handle my business. Another feature is profiles. I see a lot of people on Reddit talk about profile use. I don't particularly have a need for it, but there is a pretty solid use case for using profiles for various app installs and data separation, which I am a fan of. I just don't really need it myself for my daily use device. There is a private section where you can install apps into a locked container, and they don't show up under the normal apps menu, and you can also hide that container. That is also a pretty great a great feature that I recommend people who are adamant about having banking apps on their phone or anything that has sensitive data, especially related to money. Everybody knows how I feel about that now at this stage in the game. The podcast episodes, I've covered that extensively. And most of the things I tie back to protecting our money because everybody understands that language and equally wants to protect their own funds. So sensitive apps that have access to money or any data like that you want to protect, you have the ability to containerize it into a privacy container within Graphene. Another feature that I really appreciate is the hardware to software controls. And what I mean by that is there is a developer's menu for the hardware where you can go in and you can actually see the hardware state for the cell phone beacon, for example. And previous older versions of Android, some of them, when you put your phone in airplane mode, you could go into that developer's menu and you could see that the beacon was actually still on. So how that translates into non-technical speak is that when you put your phone on airplane mode, it's still pinging towers, even though it says it's not. iPhones, I think, did that for a period of time as well. I'm not sure if they still do that, but you don't have any control over an iPhone platform. And the GrapheneOS system has rejoined the hardware and software controls in that manner. So when you switch off your phone onto airplane mode, it actually turns off the hardware piece that is your cell tower beacon. And when you switch off your Wi-Fi, it switches off your Wi-Fi hardware. That, to me, is critical, especially for the privacy and security conscious folks out there and the extra paranoid folks like myself as well. So the need for a tool like a Faraday sleeve is less necessary for daily use when it comes to a GrapheneOS device compared to any other device. All right, so I think I've covered most of the reasons I believe Graphene can be used as a daily driver for most individuals who want to spend a little bit of extra time configuring their device in a manner to gain significant security and privacy features with relatively little effort. It's a little bit more than a standard Android device, but I think that the trade-off is well worth it. And also, you get a little bit more of a hands-on technical point of view of your device that you carry around with you. And I think that that is extremely valuable and should be something that people consider. Now, to weave back and come full circle, the stock standard OS of Android requires you to use the Google Play services, which is essentially spyware, and the Google Play Store, which requires a Gmail account. They track your location, they track your personal data, they track your internet traffic, and those things have been used many times over and publicly disclosed as being used as dragnet operations in investigations. The famous one that comes to mind is the January 6th incursion of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. They proudly put out that they had pulled a dragnet of, it's called geofencing. They geofenced the area and they looked at all of the Gmail accounts, logged in users that were in that location, that had their location beacons turned on and that were found in that area. Now, they arrested a bunch of people, and some of those people were guilty of things that were against the law in that situation. They were either rioting or vandalizing or causing problems. And then there's other famous stories that are less talked about because it's an unpopular and inconvenient thing to talk about for the law enforcement. But there is several stories of people getting either misidentified or mistakenly wrapped into that investigation who were in the area for work or other personal reasons. And one might think that isn't an issue if they get brought into that investigation and found that they weren't a part of it, or if they get into some issues and charged potential crimes and then they get found not guilty. My point is none of that is relevant. What is relevant to me is that I don't want to be mistakenly connected to any group or any event, because if my phone was tracked and I was caught up in that dragnet, then my personal identity and information is now in a potentially public record of a investigation into a scenario I had nothing to do with. And I don't want to find myself in a position to where I have to defend myself against something I did not do or justify why I was in a place. I would just rather them not have that information. Now, if you're in a place and you get pulled over or you get questioned by the police for a reason because you're physically there, that's a different story. What I'm talking about is the low-hanging fruit options for surveillance, which is geofencing. It's a very valuable tool for law enforcement these days, and most countries are using it. I don't want to be volunteering my information into those dragnet operations. If they're going to want to talk to me, they're going to have reasonable cause, and that means I hope I would position myself to where I would have to be physically there before I would ever find myself in that position. So that is a bit of a long-winded, full circle description or justification of the things I was talking about in the beginning, but the main point is control. The governments of the world use these things as sometimes for good and sometimes for nefarious reasons, but all of it is an element of control. They want control of an operation. They want control of an investigation. They want to control a scenario that is a group that's protesting or whatever the case might be. I just don't want to have anything to do with it. So I don't want my device to be able to provide that level of granularity to them as a dragnet bulk investigation or surveillance operation. Now, that might be a little paranoid for the average person, and that's going to be probably the case until somebody finds themselves in a scenario like this where it's a problem. And then usually, I would imagine that you don't even know what the hell's going on until it's too late. So for me, as I've said in previous episodes, the cell phone is the ultimate spying device. And since I have one in my pocket, just like you do, I want to be able to control my own device. Just like they want to be able to control the situation, the narrative, and the scenarios happening within their country or towns or whatever, I want to be able to control the things that I hold close to my body and have on me at all times. And so a graphene device allows me to do that more than the other ones. Now, having said all of that, let's be real. The illusion of privacy is that it's an illusion. There is really no expectation of privacy when you are surfing the internet. There's no expectation of privacy when you have the ultimate spy device of human history in your pocket and with you at every moment in time. There's also no expectation of privacy when you're out in public, legally. However, I take the stance of I want to be able to control that as much as I possibly can. The rest of it, we have to accept. I do not accept just handing over everything to governments or surveillance capitalism, data scraping companies, whatever the case might be. I want to be able to at least manage what I have in my pocket. And that is my personal justification for taking this stance on a GrapheneOS device and using it as a daily driver. So, moving forward, I want people to start thinking about what is happening with your phone and if you're comfortable with that. A lot of people don't even think about it, and we have these things on our person at all times. I just explained my stance on it. Another last thing I want to cover is the leadership around this subject. I have taken a role of leadership with my family as well as my close friend group of guiding them through this process if they're interested in it. My good friend and our mutual friend Ahmed over at the Great Dynamics team, who helps produce this podcast, he and I have spoke in length about this subject, and he had mentioned previously, I think in a Great Dynamics podcast episode, that one of our conversations had inspired him to build GrapheneOS devices for his parents, which came out of a conversation that I had with him, and I had told him that I had done for my parents. So I guided them through. I built the devices. I showed them how to use them. I showed them the quirks and a little bit of differences of how to maintain them and manage them. And then I made it to where if anything is needed, they can call me. So I've assumed that role because I wanted them to have that security and that privacy element in their life because I care about them as my family. So think about that. This is not going to be valuable to everybody, but it is going to be of interest to certain people who think it's out of their reach, and that is an opportunity for you to step up and take some ownership and show some leadership and some care in the direction of your friends and family and help them out. I have found a lot of satisfaction out of providing that to some people in my life, my parents included, as well as some close friends. So I think that those of us who have the means to be able to provide this assistance, you will find that as well. Well, that'll be it for today's episode. I appreciate you suffering through my rant again. I hope that you find value in it, and just remember that your privacy and your security is your responsibility, and your vulnerabilities and your failures, those are on you as well. I'm your host, Alan Pace, signing off. Until next time.